Well, good morning, everyone. Good to see all of you here today. And for everyone watching online today, we are beginning a brand new message series called The Ransom. Here's what this series is all about. I'll let you know up front where we're going. This Wednesday is a day that Christians refer to as Ash Wednesday. Traditionally, this begins a season that is called Lent, where for 40 days Christians prepare to celebrate the resurrection of Jesus Christ on Easter Sunday. Well, at Hope, what we're doing this year is we're going to be observing this season by looking, in this series, we're going to be looking specifically at Mark's biography of the life of Jesus and what he says happened in the moments, the day leading up to the crucifixion of Jesus Christ. Now, if you go home and you read Mark's biography, he wrote one of the 4 biographies of the life of Jesus, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. You can go home, and if you want, you can read this in about an hour. You can look it up online or download a Bible app, and you'll have it read in less than an hour. Mark is interesting because he's the most economical of all the biographers of the life of Jesus. He's always very to the point. He doesn't waste any words whatsoever. For example, if the 4 gospel writers, the 4 biographers of the life of Jesus, decided to tell the story of Little Red Riding Hood, Luke would tell the full story about Little Red Riding Hood and the picnic basket and the wolf and grandma and all that. Matthew would tell the same story, but he would tell about how Little Red Riding Hood was foretold in the Old Testament. John, he would tell you a lot about the theological or philosophical meaning behind Little Red Riding Hood. Mark would come along and he would say, well, Little Red Riding Hood went to deliver a picnic to her grandmother and then she went home. He's just very economical with his words. He doesn't waste any words. If you read his book, the first half of his book is really only making one very simple point. It's all about who is Jesus, who is Jesus, who is Jesus. And he writes to convince the audience, the reader, that he's the Son of God from heaven. So he tells about his power, his miracles, how people were constantly amazed by him. But then there's a turning point, and in the second half of his book, his focus shifts entirely on what is he here to do? Why did he come? What's his objective? And it's all about how he came to die. So when you walk away from reading Mark's biography of the life of Jesus, you get a very strong impression of Jesus as being an incredible leader. We know who he is, we know what he's here to do, and he got her done. Just an extraordinary leader. Now, objectively, if you're a Christian or not, if you just look at the life of Jesus, you have to admit this is the most effective leader in the history of the world. I mean, just think about it for a moment. Jesus had 3 years to build his brand. He had no investors, he had no frequent flyer miles, he had no computers. Yet today, in America alone, he has over 400,000 franchises. Around the world, he has well over 1 million franchises. Okay? We are still talking about him 2,000 years later. Do you know what I can tell you about you and me? No one's going to be talking about either one of us 2,000 years from now, if there is a 2,000 years from now. Jesus is clearly the most influential leader in the history of the world. Not bad for only 3 years of work. Well, today, as we begin this series, we're going to discover 2 things. We're going to discover how it is that Jesus was such an effective leader, and at the same time, as we discover that, we're going to very clearly why he came to earth. And these 2 ideas are definitely tied together. Now, for those of you who are kind of new to church, when you think of Jesus, you might not think of leadership, and I understand that, because when we think of Jesus, most of us think of a religious figure, and most of us do not associate religious figures with being good leaders, because leaders are all about the future, and religion tends to be all about the past. And leadership tends to be all about changing things and making progress. Religion tends to be all about don't touch that. We've always done it that way, right? But you know, in the church world, it's not often a leadership-friendly culture. But Jesus was the most extraordinary leader who ever lived. And those of you who are a part of Hope, we're starting to change some perceptions of the church when it comes to that. But we're going to see today not only why he was such an extraordinary leader, but the significance for you of what his leadership means. So today, we're going to be in the book of Mark. This whole series, we're going to be in the book of Mark, and really looking forward to preaching through this with you today and over the next 6 weeks. Here we go. We're in Mark chapter 10 today.
Verse 32, and Mark is recording this, and he tells us, they were on their way up to Jerusalem with Jesus leading the way, and the disciples were astonished, while those who followed were afraid. Now here's what's interesting. Jesus was this big miracle worker. He was this incredible teacher. Crowds are always flocking to him. If they had a need, hey, I need a miracle. I need something from you. I really like your sermons. I totally stay awake for all 40 minutes. When you preach, Jesus, when the Pharisees preach, I'm asleep in 10 minutes, but you just preach with authority. People are always amazed at him. Mark says something very interesting. When it comes to the crowds that were around Jesus, they had an emotional reaction to Jesus. First of all, the 12 disciples had a reaction. What does it say? It says they were astonished. And those who followed him, just the deadheads or whatever you called, the Jesus followers back then, they were afraid. Now, why would you follow someone if you were afraid of him? What's going on here? Well, they've seen a major shift in Jesus because they've seen a shift in his focus from who am I? I'm the King of Israel to what am I here to do? There's been a change in his countenance, a change in his demeanor, a change in his focus as he's going to Jerusalem. And the people are like, we've never seen anything like this. And it was so visible and obvious, it was impacting the people all around him. Mark tells us what happens. He says, again, and it says again because Jesus has already been through this with them, he took the 12 aside and told them what was going to happen to him. Now, again, if you read the book of Mark, in chapter 8, he tells them what's going to happen when he gets to Jerusalem. In chapter 9, he told them what was going to happen in Jerusalem. Now we're in chapter 10, and he's telling them, again, this is not the first time they've heard this. And again, Mark is so economical with his words. If he mentions it 3 times, it probably means Jesus was saying this again and again and again and again. And here's what he said to them again. He said, we are going up to Jerusalem, he said, and the Son of Man, that's how Jesus referred to himself, will be betrayed to the chief priests and the teachers of the law. So guys, you know how they've tried to arrest me before, but I always managed to slip away? Not this time. This time they're going to arrest me. Here's what will happen. They will condemn him to death and will hand him over to the Gentiles, who will mock him and spit on him, flog him, and kill him. 3 days later, he will rise. Now, this is such an emotional, personal moment for Jesus. He gathers the 12. Okay, I know I've told you this. I'm going to tell you one more time because things have been going great up till now. We have been at the pinnacle of success and popularity up till now. You guys better be ready. That's all about to change, and you better brace yourself for what is going to happen when we get to Jerusalem. I'm going to be betrayed. I'm going to be condemned. I will be handed over. I will be mocked. I will be spit upon. I will be flogged, and I will be crucified, and I will die. Be ready for that. Now, Jesus just has this very emotional moment with his disciples, but apparently it wasn't very emotional for them. Here's what happens next. Then, as in right then, Jesus pours out his heart. It says, then James and John, the sons of Zebedee, those are 2 of his disciples, brothers, came to him. Teacher, they said, we want you to do for us whatever we ask. Hey, Jesus, wow, golly, shucks. Sorry about that whole flogging and crucifying thing. Yeah, that's too bad. Hey, listen, we need you to do something. Now, if you're a parent, you have totally been here before. If you're a parent, you've had those moments where you're talking to your kids and something comes up, and this is one of those life-changing moments, and this is one of those life-changing principles, and you want your kids to get this, and so you pour out your heart to them, and you say, son, always remember, or sweetheart, never forget, and you just pour out your heart, and you think you're connecting, and you're going to change the trajectory of their whole life, and you say, do you understand what Dad is saying? And they look at you and they say, Dad, how come when you talk, sometimes this side of your mouth moves more than that side of your mouth? It's like, oh my goodness, did you even hear a word I said? Or they just stare at you with that look on their face and say, so can we have dessert yet? You just pour out your heart, and it's like, are you even listening? Jesus pours out his heart, and James and John are like, yeah, that's too bad. We got something to ask you, Jesus. And they begin this prayer in the most awesome way. We want you to do for us whatever we ask. Just try that when you get home later today. Dear God, will you just do for me whatever I ask? Just a very arrogant way to start a prayer, to say nothing of the circumstances in which they asked it. But Jesus is so patient, so patient. He says, what do you want me to do for you? He asks. He doesn't say, why don't you back that truck up and start over again with, excuse me, Jesus, I'm very sorry for what is about to happen to you. Or maybe, Jesus, I hate to bother you, and according to your will, I've got to, no, he's just so kind. He's so patient. I'm thankful he treats us that way. The story continues. They replied, let one of us sit at your right and the other at your left in your glory. They say, Jesus, yeah, okay, this whole flogging, mocking, spitting, dying thing, whatever, we know something about you, Jesus. We know you're the king. See, Jesus, we've been watching. We've seen your miracles. We know you're the king of Israel, and we know someday we're going to have your coronation, and you are going to kick out the Romans, and we know you're from God because you're somebody special. We know you're going to be crowned king. So when that day comes, here's our request. One of us wants to sit at your right and the other at your left in your glory. We want to be your prime minister and secretary of state. We want to be chief members in your cabinets. And Jesus, Peter's nice and all, but come on, he talks too much. We want to be your right hand and your left hand man when you enter your glory. Now, here's the irony. Where is it that Jesus will most clearly display the glory of God? At what event will Jesus show the glory of God? Where will Jesus show the incredible justice and righteousness of God coupled with the incredible love and compassion of God? He's going to show it at the cross. He just told them where his glory is going to be shown. It goes right past them, and they say, can we sit at your right and your left when you enter your glory? They don't know what they're asking for, and that's what Jesus tells them. He says, you don't know what you are asking for. Can you drink the cup I drink, or be baptized with the baptism I am baptized with? Here's what this means. Can you drink the cup that I drink? Throughout the Old Testament Hebrew Scriptures, the cup is a metaphor. The cup represents God's righteous judgment against sin. Now, before you bristle at that, isn't it true that when you look at our world and you see abuses, you see bigger countries picking on smaller countries, you see people with power killing people without power, something inside of you rises up at the injustice? Well, that happens to God too. God hates injustice. God hates iniquity. God hates sin because sin hurts the people and the creation that he loves. So throughout the Old Testament Scriptures, God's perfect justice against sin is described as a cup full of wrath and anger that is poured out on those who are responsible. Jesus, when he was in the Garden of Gethsemane, before he was crucified, he talked about this cup. He said, Father, if it is possible, may this cup be taken from me. What cup? The cup of God's judgment against sin. Because Jesus came to drink the cup of God's judgment so I wouldn't have to. He came to drink the cup of God's judgment so you wouldn't have to. He came to do this for you. He said, can you drink the cup I'm going to drink? Or he says, can you be baptized with the baptism I'm baptized with? Now, he's not talking about what we would call a Christian baptism with water in the name of the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. Baptism was an ancient Jewish metaphor to describe undergoing or being immersed in an overwhelming trial or overwhelming agony. Much like if you've ever been to the ocean and the surf pushes you under, it is overwhelming and you can't get up from it. When you undergo an incredible trial, they would call that being baptized or a baptism. And he says, I'm about to undergo an overwhelming trial. Can you drink the cup I drink? Can you be baptized with the baptism that I am baptized with? He asked them. We can, they answered, having no idea what they're talking about. Jesus said to them, You will drink the cup I drink, and be baptized with the baptism I am baptized with. But to sit at my right or left is not for me to grant. Instead, he says, those places, next slide, those places belong to those for whom they have been prepared. Now, here's what's interesting. Did you know that James and John would have very unique fates as being disciples of Jesus Christ? After the crucifixion and the resurrection of Jesus Christ, the book of Acts, A-C-T-S, in the New Testament, tells us what happened in the early first century church. James and John, James, the brother of John, was the first disciple martyred. He was the first one murdered. King Herod had arrested him. He saw how happy it made the people when he arrested one of these Jesus followers, so he had James beheaded in prison, first one to die. John was the last one to die. He was, according to tradition, he was the only of the 12 disciples who was not murdered for following Jesus. Instead, he lived to be about 100 years old. And here's what happened to him. The enemies of Jesus who hated Jesus, they who put the other disciples to death, they tried to put John to death by boiling him alive in oil. Somehow he survived, so they exiled him to an island in the Mediterranean Sea called Patmos. It's basically their version of Alcatraz, where he was banished and exiled, all for following Jesus. Jesus said, you are going to drink the cup I drink. You are going to be baptized. You're going to be overwhelmed with what I am overwhelmed with. But to sit at my right or left is not for me to grant. These places belong to those for whom they have been prepared. Now, when we look back at James and John, I mean, Jesus just said what's going to happen, and they make it all about them and their power and their authority and their glory, and we look at them, and it's easy for us to say, what idiots. How could they not get it? But the reason why Mark includes this in his biography of the life of Jesus is not that we would look at James and John and say, what idiots, but that we would instead look at ourselves and say, I wonder how I'm being an idiot. What is it that I'm missing that James and John were also missing? And what they were missing, and what many of us in the room listening this morning are missing, is we fail to appreciate the significance of the cross. We underestimate the impact of the cross. And here's the hallmark, here's the manifestation of a person who has not understood fully the implications of the cross of Jesus Christ. It comes out through pride. It comes out through arrogance. Like James and John, we're seeking authority for ourselves. We're seeking influence for ourselves. We're seeking power for ourselves, instead of being humble and using whatever authority, whatever leadership, whatever power we have to glorify God and to serve people. Now, this comes out in a dozen different ways. We could spend a whole series on this. Let me just give you one example of how this kind of pride instead of humility in the face of the cross comes out. One way it comes out is through worry. Now, if you love someone, it's very natural to worry about them, but constant worry, do you know what that's doing? It's saying, God, you're not following my script. I know how their life is supposed to go. I know how my life is supposed to go. God, you're not following the right script. I don't trust you. I need things to go the way I have planned. But genuine humility, understanding the significance of the cross, allows you to open your hands and say, God, not my will but yours. I know whatever you are doing in these circumstances, it's going to be for your glory, and it is going to be for my purification. It's going to burn off the impurities in my faith. So God, I trust you. I'll be humble and joyful before you no matter what you have in store for me, because I know it's going to end up being for the good. See, humility lets us relax no matter what the situation is, and not try and hang on to power and authority for pride for ourselves, but to let go and be very, very open-handed with all things when it comes to our lives. Humility lets God be God, and if we are being driven low, we know it's for God's glory and our good. Well, the other disciples, of course, overheard James and John or figured out what they were after with their request, and they weren't real happy with James and John when they found out, because they're being the exact same way. They're undervaluing the cross. It says, when the 10 heard about this, they became indignant with James and John. Now, they didn't become indignant like, how dare you ask Jesus that one? He just poured his heart out to us. It was indignant like, I don't want to sit at his right and left too. I call it shotgun. It's one of those immature things. And the next thing you know, it's like, nah, 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 nah. So Jesus, he's like, all right, everybody, time out. Peter, time out. Let's talk this out. Here's what happens. Jesus called them together and said, You know that those who are regarded as rulers of the Gentiles lord it over them, and their high officials exercise authority over them. They're like, of course we know that. That's how the world works, Jesus. Why do you think we want to sit at your right and left? We want to do some lording it over people. We want to do some exercising of authority over people. Yeah, we know how the world works. Jesus says, not so. Not so with you. Instead, whoever wants to be great, or whoever wants to become great among you. James, would you like to become great? John, would you like to become great? Disciples, would you like to become great? Audience reading Mark's gospel, would you like to become great? Whoever wants to become great among you, he doesn't say that's wrong, but he says we're going about it in an inverted way, in the wrong way. Whoever wants to become great among you must be your servant, and whoever wants to be first must be slave of all. He introduces a very counterintuitive way of becoming great. He says, no. The Gentiles are the ones, the unbelievers are the ones, the pagans are the ones who want to rule over, who want to lord it over whenever they get authority, whenever they get influence, whenever they get power, but not so with you. Now, if you've ever seen this principle put into action, you know how powerful it is. In fact, I bet that some of the people in your life who have had the most profound impact on your life in a positive way were men and women, parents, teachers, coaches, bosses, managers, people who practice this principle of taking their authority, their position of leadership, and using it to serve you. If you have ever worked in that kind of environment, you know how powerful it is when the person who is over you, when they are trying to serve you and make you successful. That's an environment where you thrive. That's the kind of person you admire and look up to and gladly follow. But most of us, all of us, have had parents, have had teachers, have had coaches, have had bosses who, when they got into their leadership authority, they took everything under their authority and they leveraged it for their own glory, their own success, their own fame, and they leveraged it all for keeping all of their power. And what impact did that have on you? You despised them. You looked down on them because they wanted it to be all about them and their pride and their ego. And if they had any impact on your life, it wasn't a good one. Except maybe it taught you never want to be that way. Jesus said, when it comes to leadership, when it comes to authority, what you do with that is you leverage it for the benefit of the people under your authority. That's what you do if you want to be an incredible leader. And then Jesus, the most influential leader in the history of the world, shows us how he became the most influential leader in the world. Here's what he said. For even the Son of Man Even me, Jesus Christ, true God, true man, came from heaven, the one who is rightly the most important person, no matter what room I walk into, no matter what restaurant I walk into, no matter what environment or conversation I walk into, I am the most authoritative, most powerful, and smartest person in that room, in that restaurant, in that conversation. Me, even the Son of Man, the one who can rightfully claim all respect, did not come to be served, but to serve and to give his life as a ransom for many. Jesus, why did you come? I did not come to be served. As the Son of God, I could have demanded that, but I did not come to be served. I came to serve and to give his life as a ransom for many. Now we have two very important words I want to unpack. If you have your program with you, you can fill in these blanks if you want to follow along this way. The word ransom in the Greek language, it's a word lutron, and what it means, see, when we use the word ransom in English, we only use it in terms of a hostage or a kidnap situation, where if you want to get an innocent person back, you bring a ransom. The Greek concept was a little different than our American concept of ransom. Ransom means to buy the freedom of a slave or prisoner, not an innocent person who is kidnapped. If there's a slave, or if there's someone, an inmate in prison, if they wanted freedom, someone had to come along and ransom them. They had to bring along a pile of money that is equivalent to their value. So if you wanted to spring someone from prison, you brought along a ransom. How bad was what they did? Here's a big pile of money. I have now purchased their freedom. If there is a slave and you want to give that slave freedom, you have to bring along a big pile of money equal to their value as a slave labor and put it down on the table, and you have now purchased their ransom. Jesus said, I have not come to be served, but to serve and to give my life as a ransom. I've come to give my life to buy freedom of a slave or prisoner. Next word we saw was the word for. Here's what the word for means. Also a very significant word. The Greek word is anti. For means instead of or in the place of. Instead of or in the place of. Literally what Jesus is saying is this: I came to give my life to purchase the freedom of slaves or prisoners instead of the many. I came to use my life to buy the freedom of slaves and prisoners in the place of the many. If you have a prisoner, you bring your pile of money in the place of the prisoner. The problem with sin is that it makes us slaves to sin. The problem with sin is that it makes us slaves to death. We cannot stop sinning. We cannot stop dying. How do we get freedom from that? It's a cosmic debt. You can't bring along a pile of money when you have a cosmic debt. But Jesus, what did he do? He brought along a cosmic payment for sin. The life of the Son of God himself. He said, I have come to give my life to buy the freedom of the slaves to sin, to buy my freedom of the slaves of death instead of the many lives, in the place of the many lives. Now, before I mentioned that for some of us, we don't take the cross seriously enough. And the result is that we are arrogant and full of pride, and we're not humble before it. But for some of us, we take the cross too seriously. Here's what I mean by that. It becomes so offensive to us, the idea that a God who is love would require the blood sacrifice of his Son. Because for some of you who are offended by this, I realize what it sounds like. It sounds like Christianity is just another ancient, bloodthirsty religion of bloodthirsty, savage cultures where it's all about blood sacrifice and vengeful, petty gods. For example, in the ancient work, the Iliad by Homer, we have the character Agamemnon who cannot get fair winds to Troy, so he sacrifices his daughter so that the gods, he's serious, he really wants some wind. So he sacrifices his daughter and then they give him winds so he can go to Troy. We look at Christianity and say, is that all that is? I mean, if God actually is love, you Christians, if God actually is love, then why doesn't he just forgive sins? Why doesn't he just say, I forgive you, you're forgiven, go free, because I am love? If God is really loving, why doesn't he just forgive everyone? Why would he demand the death of his son? Let me give you the beginning of this answer. We're going to unpack this for the next 6 weeks, but here's the beginning of the answer. Jesus did not have to die in spite of God's love. Jesus died because of God's love, and he did that because all life-changing love requires a substitutionary sacrifice. All life-changing love requires a substitutionary sacrifice. If you meet a person who has their life completely put together, they have no issues. They are not emotionally needy. They are not physically needy. They just have their life put together. They have no baggage. There might be a few people like that somewhere in the state. And if you're their friend, it's going to be an incredible experience, because being around them will always be replenishing. It will never be draining. But if your friends are normal, they have emotional neediness, they have baggage, they have issues, and it is impossible to enter a friendship with them without some of that rubbing off on you and sticking to you. Let me illustrate this a few different ways. For those of you who are parents, parenting requires substitutionary sacrifice. When you have children, they're in a state of childishness. They're immature. They cannot take care of themselves. They're needy. So, parents, what they do is they decide, I'm going to sacrifice my life for quite some time in order to develop these children out of their childishness. It involves providing for them. It involves reading and reading and reading to them so they'll intellectually develop. And the books you're reading are usually not very riveting, to be perfectly honest. And you sing songs to them to develop their minds and imaginations. And after a while, you don't care what the fox said. And you listen to them count to 100, and they do it again and again and again, and you're just trying to stay awake. But if you do not pour into them, and some parents don't. Some parents will not make the sacrifice. Their children will not grow up. They'll get older, but they'll just be needy and immature older people. See, when it comes to parenting, either the parents can make a short-term sacrifice in a redemptive way, or they can sacrifice the lives of their children in a non-redemptive way for the rest of their lives, as they will remain immature. Life-changing love requires substitutionary sacrifice. Or for those of you in high school, think of it this way. Let's say there's a girl in your high school and she's not one of the cool kids. And you are one of the cool kids, and you think to yourself, I'm going to help this girl out. I'm going to befriend this girl who is not one of the cool kids. And next thing you know, one of the other cool kids walks up to you and says, what are you doing with her? Because now that you've befriended her, her uncoolness is rubbing off on you. Because when you enter into a relationship, it always rubs off on you. Life-changing love requires a substitutionary sacrifice. If you are going to help someone who is in financial need, if you are going to help someone who is in emotional need, you cannot do it for free. It is always going to cost you something, because that's what life-changing love does. It requires a substitutionary sacrifice. Or even just think of forgiveness itself. Somebody harms you. Somebody hurts you. Somebody takes something from you. The most natural thing you can do is pay them back according to what they've done to you. The most natural thing you can do is make them hurt the way that they hurt you. But do you realize what you're doing when you do that? You're just making everything that's wrong with the world continue its cycle. You're making everything you hate about the world continue in its cycle. And the only way you are going to break that cycle and make the world a better place and change the world and maybe change them and even change yourself is through substitutionary sacrifice. You have to forgive, and to forgive means you just absorb the hurt in order to change your life, change their life, change the world. Life-changing love requires substitutionary sacrifice. And let me tell you this, anyone who has ever changed your life Anyone who has ever positively impacted your life did it at personal expense. The love of God is no different. We had a cosmic debt of sin to God that we could not repay. And how did God respond to that? He decided to change your life, and He decided to change your eternity, and He did it through a substitutionary sacrifice, because life-changing love requires a substitutionary sacrifice. In other words, there is a sense in which God could say, "Let there be light," and there was light. And God could say, "Let there be oceans," and there were oceans. And God could say, "Let there be mountains," and there were mountains. But God could not simply say, "Let there be forgiveness." God made the world through His powerful word. But He had to remake the world through the substitutionary sacrifice of Jesus Christ, who did not come to be served, but to serve and give His life as the payment. Give His life in order to buy the freedom of the prisoners and slaves to sin and death, and to give His life instead of the lives of the many. That's the message of the cross. Which means that the cross teaches us something about sin, and it teaches us something about grace. Here's what it teaches us. God's justice, His cup of wrath against sin, it is so righteous that Jesus had to die. His grace is so large, His love is so large, that Jesus was glad to die. For you, for me, for the many. Because to redeem a person, to give ransom, it requires substitutionary sacrifice. Now, this is really just an introduction for everything we're going to be talking about in this series over the next 6 weeks. But here's my question for you as we finish today. Does this change you? Does this radically impact your life? Next week, we're going to talk about something that Jesus gave to you to make sure it does. Let's pray. Father in heaven, thank you for inspiring Mark to record this incredible account for us. Thank you for the example of James and John, because honestly, so many of us are just like them. We want to make this world about us. We want to make it about our glory and our kingdom instead of being humble, not appreciating the cross. Father, for those listening today, they've never heard this truth. I ask that even if they might not accept it right now, that they would just be humble and honest enough to think about it, to think about who Jesus is and what He did on our behalf, because you have given us such love at personal cost that does change us, and it changes us in a way that is good. It makes us know that we have value as children of God, as dearly loved by you, as your possessions. It makes us know that there is a God in heaven who loves us because you paid dearly for us. Father, wherever we are at with this, I ask that we will have the wisdom to understand this truth and the courage to trust you in it. We pray this in the name of Jesus. Amen.